Every step in shoemaking has a why, and if you can answer the why question, you will go a long way in creating very great and wonderful designs. I remain your aspiring footwear professor, Peter Shalom Jebe. Welcome to this channel once again. In this very video, we'll be looking at making the sectional patterns of our shoe. The sectional patterns comprises of the working pattern, the net pattern, and the lining pattern. We're going to start with the net pattern. That's from the standard we've created in our previous videos. Keep following us for more updates on how to make shoe as we get to know the why and the kind of patterns that we'll create for all kind of shoes. This is a casual shoe pattern, and we're going to be making the sectional patterns all together. If you've not subscribed to this very channel, click on the subscribe button and also click on the notification button as well as you follow us for more updates. So the next thing to do here is to fold the paper into two. Make sure the paper is wide enough to accommodate both parts by picking up your standard form, checking how wide it could be when it's being sprung. So place it on the edges. The purpose of the tangent line is to have a straight line that will be in line with the folded edge of the paper. So that is the purpose, both the instep line and the straight line from both sides. This is the purpose of the line. Note the method of tracing from this very part here. Now let's trace from the first part. We're not tracing everything, okay? It's just from the front part towards the back part a little bit. Now we're going to spring. This is what we call springing. You hold it at the tip of the thumb, then you now spring it down. Something that will just hold it on the line from that first line. Some can spring from the center point, but mostly I do my springing from the tip. This is what we call springing. Remember, the tangent line on the instep and the tangent line on the thumb. That is the purpose. Before you go with the other part of it, that is the tracing process. Those perfected lines that you've perfected earlier, you now trace them before joining them together. This is what we call springing. Now connect this line, the second part from the back part of the standard form. Trace them all, and also from the back part trace it as well. I want you to know the extended top line that we've traced from the center of the gate point. The line was extended backward. That is why we have that protrusion at the back, as you can see. So now is a guide for us to connect those parts together. Let me repeat the process. As you can see from the line here at the top, make sure it's a straight line. Now spring it. That is what we call springing. We spring, then trace the other part from the back part, both the lines, so that will connect them. This is what we call the net pattern. Now we're going to get a 90 degree that will give us our tongue. Remember, the tongue was a 90 degree from the standard form. Connect all other components together. We have a straight line from all sides, connect it together, as well as connecting the other part as well together. The line, the top line that was extended, is very, very important as well. So we connect them together. You can see there are differences from the top and the bottom. Look at the back part, look at this very line, it's different. If the purpose is, if you trace it that straight, you end up having a further edge that will not reach the lasting allowance. It will affect your work. So now we label it net pattern. This pattern does not carry any allowance. The purpose is most reinforcement when we're making use of materials that need to be reinforced. That is, materials that needed something to make it stronger or thicker. That is when the net pattern comes in. We use a net pattern as a reinforcement before we fold or other things. So we cut it off. Now we'll go into the next pattern. The standard form plays a very important role because it carries all the patterns that you will be needing, from the net pattern, the working pattern, and the lining pattern. That is what the standard form carries. So it will be the only pattern that will be using to get the other patterns, so that when there will be an error, it will be minimal. Sometimes people trace the net pattern and you go about tracing the net pattern again. At the end, you might have an increase, because in shoemaking, any small thing can increase your material. That is either your patterns. When you don't use the proper pattern, even the size of a pen can also increase your materials. So it can affect your shoe size when lasting your shoe. And when making patterns, we look at the kind of material we use as well when designing patterns. If you are dealing with a stretchy material, there are ways when you design your pattern as a pattern cutter, you have the material in mind. Remember that design itself carries everything about the shoe, so also the kind of materials you'll be using for the shoe. So it is applicable for the pattern cutter. You think about the material, you know the kind of material. If it's a stretchy kind of material, the pattern, you consider it. If it's a thick material, you consider that as well, so that when making the patterns, you look into it and you make the pattern in such a way that you conform to the materials you'll be making use of. So this is just the next pattern that we're making. The next pattern is going to carry an allowance of 5mm, and the 5mm is for the purpose of folding. We'll be adding the millimeter from all angles, that's from the top and the back part, to enable us stitch, even though we have some standard measurement for all of this. Folding allowance is 5mm. We have what we call the underlay allowance or overlapping allowance is 10mm, and we also have the trimming allowance of 3mm. But I do advise, if you are not sure of your trimming allowance, you use 5mm for your trimming allowance. That is the advice I do give for people who are just starting in the shoemaking journey. So now let's fold the paper again and get the second part of our pattern, that is the working pattern. Mind you, we're folding these papers horizontally. There are times where we'll need to fold it vertically, depending on the direction we are getting our pattern. So we fold it horizontally because of the vamp. Okay, it's the vamp that we are getting. That was why we're folding it horizontally. It will really repeat when the getting process the again counter. You see the difference. Working pattern, trace halfway, and let's bring again, then trace the remaining parts again as we made with the net pattern. Invariably, we're tracing the net pattern, then we'll now add 5mm allowance. Remember, the net pattern was not carrying any pattern at all, any allowance rather at all. Using our divider, or preferable our compass, we measure 5 mm from the tongue, 5 mm from the top line, and 5 mm at the back part. Though the back part is to be at least 5 mm or 3 mm, preferable 3 mm, which is a stitching allowance. But because you're dealing with something you're not used to, it's preferable you use 5 mm to be on the safer side. So 5 mm is your good to go. That's when you have to stitch the back part. 5 mm. If you're not sure of cuffs, you make use of your compass or your divider. Measure 5 mm, then draw your straight line on it as you fold round. Connect them together. So that is just it about the allowances. You can see the difference. The net pattern is not carrying any allowance, while the working pattern is carrying allowance. The working pattern is the main pattern you use on your main upper. The purpose of the allowance is for you to have what we call the folding allowance. That is a 5 mm folding allowance. Connect them, and that will be all for this very segment. That will now move into cutting of the lining pattern. To make the work more easier for you, you can decide to perforate from the net line where your allowances will start from, so that when you trace your pattern, you don't have to be searching for a net pattern to trace again before having your folded allowances. Don't forget to spoil the line that is not important. Okay, always trace and have your main line and also the line that is not important, so that I won't trace the wrong line. That is the essence of the notches I create like a V on the lines after perforation. Our working pattern is ready. Now let's go to the next pattern, the lining pattern. The lining pattern comprises of two major parts, that is the back part, which is the counter, and the front part, which is the van point. So we're going to be getting these two patterns after getting what we call our working pattern. Don't forget to label your patterns. It's very important because you have to be dealing with different kind of last. So write the code of your last, the date and the time, and the date rather, for the sake of referencing, so that you can easily know the kind of last you're using. Remember, the last that you use for your work are different kind of last, so it's very good that you label them and have them for reference purposes. Now the pattern, let's fold our paper again and continue as we proceed to the next one. Let's place it on our line as usual. Repeat the process by tracing halfway as we did, then we spring it again. Let's spring. Now let's trace the tongue as well as the top line, but in this case we are not going full. It's not going to be a full kind of tracing because the lining is broken down into two. We have the counter and we have the vamp as well. So let's trace it halfway because we're going to be having an underlay or an overlapping on each other. So you can see the lining here is halfway, not complete. So after you trace, we add 10 mm overlapping allowance, as is popularly known, they will call it underlay allowance, 10 millimeter underlay allowance. But at the top here, everything will be adding 5 millimeter. I advise 5 millimeter, even though it's 3 millimeter allowance, but I advise you're not used to that, use 5 millimeter allowance. I normally use 3 millimeter, and 3 millimeter is a perfect allowance. But you're not sure of your material, you're not certain of everything, the best thing is to use 5 millimeter allowance. So I'm using 5 millimeter allowance. That's half centimeter if you want to use a centimeter. And let's go 10 millimeter allowance. Let's measure it and trace it and join them together. That's underlay allowance, where the counter will be resting on. That's the essence of the underlay allowance. Getting our counter now, we'll fold the paper again. In this case, we are not folding horizontally, but we are folding it vertically, in this case, to get our counterpoint. Remember, when folding our paper, we'll fold horizontally so that we can get the vamp, but now we're folding so that we'll get the counter point of the shoe lining. That's the counter of the lining. Let us zoom it so that we can have a bigger look or closer look at how to place our counter. Don't bother much about the allowance you'll be getting. Just, even though it's at least 3 millimeter, there's no problem, you have that allowance perfectly. Just make sure it's at the tip of the top line, that's the back height. Trace it out, trace everything out, then connect them together. Remember, that straight line is a guide, always a guide for you. In this case, you now join the lines together from both sides. That's the top line, then the counter line as well. You're not adding any allowance because it's going to be resting on top of the back part of your vamp. That's the vamp line from your vamp line. Add 5 millimeter as we did earlier at the top line. 5 millimeter as we did. Use your protractor and your compass rather, or your divider, to get your line. Very important if you are not good at measurement. Cut it out. A straight line, cut them out. At the back part of it also, just create a small notch by cutting it out. Just a small cut. You will be stitching it perhaps, though most time I don't stitch that, but this is how it's going to look at the counter and the front part. Our lining is ready and set for work. So this is how far we go in our pattern cutting. We're able to create our pattern, the lining and the standard form, or rather we started with the mean form, the standard form, then we now have what we call the net pattern, the lining pattern, and the working pattern. This is just a breakdown of all the patterns that we have so far, starting with the last, the form, that's the in and out, the standard and the mean form, rather the standard form. We now move into the net pattern, the working pattern, the lining pattern. Our patterns are ready for the next phase, which is the cutting. That's cutting of our materials. That is how far we can go today. It's good to have you around. I hope you have a very wonderful session with us here. I remain your aspiring footwear professor. Keep following us for more update on how to make shoe. To be part of our mentorship class, you can register yourself and be a part of our mentorship class, so you can have one-on-one private mentorship, which we always hold every month and at your own pace and any time of your choice as well. We have our classes specially for you. The next thing I forgot to do is making the back strap. Back strap is very simple. We take the measurement, the total measurement of our back height, that's the back height, and the lasting allowances, divided by 3. 95 is the total length I have, that's 95 millimeter. So we divide 95 millimeter into 3 places. 95 divided by 3, we have approximately 32.5 approximately. So we'll now go ahead and measure them, divided by the 3 points that we have. Yes, here we go. So what we'll do is now we'll measure on the width part, that's from the top. We're breaking into 4 parts. That's the top, the center, the medium part. We have 10, 7, 10, then 20 or 16 millimeter. That is the measurement we'll be using for our back strap. If you are not good at freehand, I always advise get a French cuff. It will go a long way in helping you get wonderful cuffs as you make your patterns. 10, 7, 10, 16 or 20. That's the first one. We have 10, so we'll measure 10 down, 7, we have 10, then we have 16 or 20. I use 20 on this very one precisely. I love it. So now create your curve from this part to meet, and that is just that about our back strap. There are different kind of back strap that you can create, but this is just one of the major ones. You don't need to use a back strap that is too big unless you're creating a back strap for the purpose of fashion, that's to match your design. You can increase it as well, but in this case it's just a back strap that will support the shoe. This is our back strap. That's how far we can go. Remember, subscribe on this channel and we'll keep you updated on our pattern making classes and shoemaking in general. You can drop your comment on the comment section, and for those in paid class, you can reach us on the group.